Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video. In this video for the 5th anniversary of a game that comes from a series that I have talked about quite a bit on this channel, but this specific entry being one that I've been very open about not liking. Here we will be talking about my thoughts on Life is Strange Before the Storm, a prequel to the original Life is Strange, and a terrible one at that. Now, I will say that before my latest replay, I was actually expecting to like Before the Storm more. When replaying it, now not being as attached to the original anymore, but no, I still hate it. I still find it to be a really abhorrent prequel, one that has no care in trying to connect itself to the original entry, feeling like a game written using only vague details of the original game without having actually played it for themselves. That leaves many aspects of this game's story making no sense based on what we see in the first game. But even beyond that, I just simply think this is a terribly written game even in its own right, with it somehow having even more cringy dialogue and melodramatic story moments than the first game. Which in the first game, I felt like these sort of moments had a level of charm to them, but here they really just come off as ridiculous. And really, I am mind blown that the general perception of this game is that it's good, and people love like the Chloe and Rachel relationship, which for me, I've never been able to take seriously, and really Chloe as a character was one that I've never been able to fully sympathize with either, with me not loving this overly rebellious nature that she exudes. Also, another thing that throws me off here is how the original actors for many of the recurring characters from the first game end up not reprising their roles here due to a voice actor strike occurring during this game's production that led to Ashley Birch in particular not reprising her role as Chloe here, which, while her performance wasn't perfect the first time around, I do think our portrayal of Chloe is better than what we got here, which is certainly not terrible, but I do feel like Rihanna DeVries didn't really bring as much charisma to the character as Ashley did. But strangely though, Ashley Birch was brought in to supervise the writing of Chloe's character, which didn't turn out to help that much. And strangely, considering how much I'm going to bash on this game moving forward, I don't think the team of Deck 9, the developers of this game, is a bad team. I mean, they bizarrely end up making True Colors, which to me is objectively the best Life is Strange game, but I just feel like this is a game that took away aspects that I love from the original Life is Strange. The time travel elements, the themes of nostalgia, and instead really exemplified the things I didn't like about the original game, to where this game for me ends up being a largely unenjoyable experience. But with that, let's run through the game to further explain why I don't like it. Starting off with episode 1, Awake, which starts with Chloe standing by a railroad track as a train nears her, and she's smoking a cigarette at the same time, and then jumps out of the train's way and later crosses a no trespassing sign. And again, this intro instantly shows me what I hate about Chloe's character and her writing in this game, where it really feels like the writers are trying way too hard to make Chloe edgy here, to the point where it just comes off as ridiculous. But then we end up heading towards the old mill where a concert is happening inside. But to get inside, we have to start an argument with the bouncer, to which he will let you in if you win, leading us to the introduction to the backtalk system, this new gameplay mechanic that again stems from Chloe being this edgy teenager that has to argue with everyone, and really it just ends up being a series of standard dialogue choices, but along the way Chloe ends up insulting her opponent at every opportunity, and you have to select the correct responses, which usually involves a phrase using a term that was previously stated by your opponent, and really this is just a dumb system to me. But once inside the old mill, you can interact with the people at the bar and steal money and buy pot with that money, which again plays into these aspects of Chloe's character that I don't like. But here we can have our first interaction with Frank Bowers, who, despite him being a more antagonistic figure for Chloe by the time of Life is Strange 1, his and Chloe's relationship at this point seems to be in a better state, which is fine for now, but we do get some really ridiculous moments later on that play into why I hate this game as much as I do, especially as a prequel to the original game. Now they're going upstairs, Chloe gets assaulted by two guys that she bumps into at the bar, leading to her being saved by Rachel Amber, who is a character I am largely conflicted with in this game, with Rachel being a mostly likable figure here, and while that aligns with Chloe's perspective of her by the time in the first game, we know from the first game that she was doing a lot of things behind Chloe's back that make a lot of their relationship, especially from Rachel's perspective, to feel unnatural here. And also I do feel like this game takes away from the mysterious tone that Rachel Amber's character had in that first game. That makes the luster of her character here fade, where we get to obviously see a lot more of her. But this does end up being a solid intro to their relationship, with Rachel having saved Chloe and them ending up spending the rest of the night partying at the concert. But Then we awaken the next morning where Chloe partakes in more Chloe-esque activities, but here we have the first of Chloe's outfit changes, where you could pick what Chloe wears. This usually happens once an episode, and really ends up being an irrelevant system, but is something that was promoted as this big change to the gameplay here. Probably the most interesting inclusion to this game from my point of view is how Max's diary ends up being replaced by Chloe's letter to Max, where you can read them to give you more perspective on Chloe's thoughts on their relationship, but also the events that are happening around her. After getting up here, we do get a tedious gameplay section of trying to find Chloe's phone, through finding her mom's phone first to call her phone, and then also we later have to bring Joyce her purse, which is just kind of boring. But this leads to a conversation with Joyce, where decisions you have here can have minor effects on how she treats you moving forward. But also here we get our first interaction with David, who at this point is Joyce's new boyfriend, but we need him to take us to school. But first, we have to help him fix his car, which is also an annoying section. You can start a fight with him as expected, which, to be fair, would be in line with the character based on what we saw in the first game. But strangely after this, Chloe ends up going to sleep during the drive, leading to a dream sequence where she's in the car of her dad as he is driving towards his death, leading to the crash occurring at the end of it. And again, this game is really strange in the fact that it shows Chloe coming to terms with her father's death, and that's supposed to be like a major aspect of this game's narrative, which doesn't make sense considering by the time of the original game, a major motivation of Max going back in time to undo William's death in episode 3 is because Chloe hasn't gotten over it. So again, a lot of this just felt ridiculous to me. But finally, we arrive at Blackwell Academy, where we can interact with a bevy of characters, ranging from new characters like Elliot, who ends up being a weirdo in this game. We have Skip, who is a security guard at Blackwell that assumedly held the position right before David did, though him and Chloe have a pretty positive relationship with them talking about music. We also have Steph and Mikey, who are these two nerdy best friends playing a tabletop game that you can join in on, during which, if you do play a tabletop game, it goes on forever. But Steph ends up being a pretty noble character here for randomly ending up being a major character in True Colors, where to me she becomes a much more likable character in True Colors, but here she ends up just being a mostly forgettable side character. But also here we do have some returning characters to interact with, all of which I feel like are handled terribly. First, we have Victoria, who you can sabotage the homework of, and I find Victoria's role in the story here to be really dumb, as the game implies that Chloe had this rivalry with Victoria, despite the fact that when they're in the same scene in Life is Strange 1, none of this is mentioned, almost as if Victoria doesn't know who Chloe is. Also, Chloe has a pretty hostile relationship with Principal Wells, to where you have the option of arguing with them here, but the story continues from trying to enter the school, where at this moment we end up seeing a fight between Drew North, Mikey's older brother, and Nathan, with Nathan essentially being bullied here, and a random new character named Samantha comes to his defense and tries to persuade you to help Nathan as well, which you can ignore, but if you don't, this also doesn't work into conjunction with Life is Strange 1, where again, you can stop Nathan's bully here, which you would think would be something that would really endear Nathan to Chloe. But no matter what, by the time of the first game, we know that he literally murders her in the normal timeline, and even outside of that, had previously drugged her and taken pictures of her, which makes this sympathetic portrayal of Nathan in this game to be something that just does not work for me. But once finally entering the school, we do end up bumping into Rachel once again, only for her to drag us into her drama class, which really just felt like setup for the eventual Tempest play in the next episode. But this ends up being a really cringy scene that does lead to Rachel changing and asking for Chloe to get her belt, which can lead to another awkward scene of Chloe walking in on her while she's changing. But either way, this leads to them skipping school and ending up on a train, where the two play Two Truths and a Lie, and this is really just a massive bonding scene for the duo that also blatantly implies their potential future romantic relationship. But then we get to the Overlook, where we have them wanting to play another game, this time of spying on the people around the park and mocking them, leading to another convoluted section of trying to find a way to fix the viewfinder that they intend on using, but once you do, and you end up mocking the fellow park goers, and what is supposed to be this like endearing scene of the two characters bonding, but I just found this to be a scene filled with terrible dialogue. But eventually we end up seeing a man and a woman kissing under a tree, during which Rachel ends up looking distressed, foreshadowing that the man turns out to be Rachel's father, And the entire handling of this scene and the information that Rachel's father's cheating on her mother is just so ridiculous and so melodramatic to me, to where it just feels really forced. But again, we'll talk about it later. But this does lead to Rachel talking about wanting to get drunk, leading to another convoluted plot of them trying to steal some wine from a couple in the park, where Rachel shows her acting skills. But again, another ridiculous scene in my eyes that no matter how you play it, they end up escaping with the wine anyway. But then we get the two at the junkyard, where we do see them walking along the train tracks in a similar way to how Max and Chloe did in episode 2 of the first game. And eventually we do get a bit of a spat between the two, with Rachel still being upset by the recent revelation, and during this fight you get to quantify their relationship as either a friendship or something more. Obviously the latter option furthering the romantic nature of their relationship, but either way, Rachel leaves wanting to be alone, leaving us to Chloe being Chloe and getting upset and deciding to break everything in the junkyard, but conveniently ends up stumbling across her father's wrecked car, leading to another dream sequence where William advises her on her relationship with Rachel. And again, I just never really loved these dream sequences in this game. I get the purpose of them, but to see this amount of introspection and this unfiltered adoration she has for her father doesn't really align with what we see in the first game. But then we get to the end of episode 1 through awakening from our dream, with it now being nighttime, and we return to the Overlook, where we find Rachel, where she reveals the situation about her dad, which leads to Rachel taking a photo of her as a kid with her dad, and she ends up burning it, throwing it in the trash, and kicks the trash over, causing a massive wildfire that Rachel faces no ramifications from, which is ridiculous in its own right. But strangely, we also have this scene containing Rachel letting out this ridiculous scream that, through doing so, seemed to strengthen the intensity of the fire, which I remember first seeing this thinking that, oh, they're setting up Rachel having some sort of power, which was something that I thought was a really missed opportunity in the first game. But no, she just screams because she's pissed at her dad, and also making it more likely that she's going to get caught, even though she doesn't eventually get caught. But again, none of this matters anyway. Again, I get the thematic nature of the wildfire and how it's utilized in the story moving forward, but I still find this entire plot point really dumb. But the episode does end in a similar way to some of the initial Life is Strange episodes, where we do get this montage of other characters reacting to the fire, including a shot of the woman that Rachel's dad was cheating with, alluding to the mystery of her importance in the narrative. But with that, we jump into episode 2, Brave New World, which I know is pretty highly regarded within the Life is Strange community, and yes, it is the best episode before the storm, but that's really not saying much. I do start the episode in Principal Wells' office the next day, where Rachel and Chloe are in trouble for having skipped school. And some of the evidence being used against Chloe here can change based on the choices she made in the previous episode, but Rachel ends up trying to take the blame for it, which leads to Wells threatening to take away her role in the Tempest, and we do get a choice of Chloe either going along with this or taking the blame, where to me taking the blame always felt like the correct option here, where it does feel like more of what Chloe would do here. But it does end up leading to Chloe being expelled and Rachel's role in the play being reinstated. And really, the fact that the other option doesn't lead to Chloe getting expelled is kind of dumb, considering we know Chloe gets expelled at some point in the original game. So again, I don't get why they just didn't make that a guarantee in the story here. But this is followed by another edgy Chloe moment where she's told to clear her locker, and we have her lying to Skip about needing to use the bathroom, leading to her tagging the entire bathroom. Which again, the game shows us as this fun character moment for Chloe, when in reality it just continues to show her as a terrible human being. But this is followed by Chloe getting into an argument with Joyce and David, obviously upset by her situation. It ends up leading to David becoming this more authoritarian figure, with Joyce allowing him to do so in order to straighten her up. And through this, David announces that he's moving in as well, which again, all of this just feels like a ridiculous series of massive blows to Chloe's character here, in this David situation probably having a bigger impact on her than the actual expulsion. But this leads to Chloe storming off to the junkyard, where she once again beats things up before finding a truck that she decides to repair. It's being the truck that she drives in the original game, but this leads to a scavenger hunt for items to use to repair the truck. Really, this entire sequence is just kind of boring, but afterwards we get another dream sequence. That's William roasting marshmallows with the wreckage of the car, where he ends up warning her about the dangers of fire, obviously being a metaphor for Rachel Amber, which is something that Chloe never actually does anything about. And this is followed by Rachel being the one to awaken her, knocking on the window, where the two are able to repair their relationship and end up talking about running away together, which is obviously never going to happen, though it's obviously something we heard about their plans of in the original game. But eventually Chloe gets a call from Frank, who wants to meet up with her, and when approaching his RV, we end up seeing the mysterious woman leaving right beforehand, making you question her connection to Frank, especially considering his refusal to tell you anything about her. But also here, we get to see Pompidou as a puppy during a tedious fetch quest of giving Frank his account book. But here we do get the reveal that Drew owes $1,000 to Damon Merrick, the drug lord that Frank and Drew work for, and for some reason tasks us with being the one to get the money for him, which is even more ridiculous considering Chloe had just been expelled from Blackwell, which obviously makes her persona non grata there. But once there, we do get this dumb mission of trying to steal Samuel's keys to get into the dorms, which has us doing this really convoluted section of shooing away a bird that Evan is photographing to the point where he's distracted. That allows her to damage a sprinkler so that this will distract Samuel to the point where we can steal the keys. So that's something. But also along the way we get interrupted by Skip, where you can either earn his trust or anger him, but none of this matters as he doesn't play a factor in the story moving forward. But then we reach Drew's room, where we have to find the combination to his locked trunk that contains the money, which conveniently when doing so she gets caught by Mikey and Drew, with it turning out that Drew was planning on running away with the money. But here we have Damon arriving at his room, which makes you question why did Chloe have to go here to begin with if Damon was always going to chase after Drew anyway. But here we are given the choice of letting Damon beat up Drew or intervening and sticking up for him, which the latter actually upsets Drew as it eventually leads to Mikey getting hurt, while the opposite obviously leads to Drew himself getting injured. So either way, not a great outcome. But we are also given the choice of whether or not to keep the money, which seems like a very cold-blooded thing for her to do here in keeping the money in this situation, where, again, this makes Chloe come off even more negatively, where she's taking money from a guy that literally just got beat up. But really, a lot of the scene just felt like it was here to set up Damon as a main antagonist moving forward, and giving you this morally conflicting decision, though really none of it actually matters that much. But then we return to the main campus, where the Tempest play is about to start, where we once again get a moment with Nathan, where we can hear him getting berated by his father, which further tries to humanize him, but again in a really forced way here. And if you do end up encouraging him here, it makes their relationship in the first game even more ridiculous. But the story does continue by going into the changing room, where we end up interacting with Victoria once again. Another weird scene in context of Life is Strange 1, with the scene furthering the hostile relationship between the two, with us getting Victoria to drop out of the play, either through backtalking her or drugging her tea. Though if Rachel wasn't taken out of the play to begin with, Victoria will be the one trying to drug Rachel here instead, and we will either warn Rachel, causing Victoria to drink her own drug tea, or we just distract her, in which we switch the cups, leading to her still drinking it anyway. But either way, this ends up with Rachel keeping the main role in the play, while conveniently a last-second replacement is needed for another role, leading to Chloe being convinced to take the part, leading to one of the most notable scenes of the game of us playing as Chloe during the play, and Rachel goes off script. They start metaphorically talking about their relationship, which is a scene that obviously boons their relationship, but it does come off as extremely heavy-handed to me, and one that always came off as ridiculous. And to be honest, boring at points as well, where this really just feels like a scene that wasn't really necessary for the main plot. But then in the aftermath of the play, we do see the pair wandering down a neighborhood street, which does end up being a more impactful scene for their relationship, with you having the opportunity to kiss Rachel, and along the way they end up solidifying their plans to leave Arcadia Bay with the intention of leaving later this night, with them making a stop at Rachel's house to pick up her belongings, leading to the final scene of the episode, where we officially end up meeting the Ambers at their house and spend time with them as Rachel goes to freshen up. But annoyingly, gameplay-wise, this section ends up leading to you setting up the dinner table and asking Rachel's dad, James, about what he wants to drink, and this was all boring. But it all leads up to the dinner. Again, it obviously ends up being really tense here, with us obviously knowing that James has kissed that woman at the park, and Rachel's frustrations get more and more blatant as the scene continues. But here we are given the choice of calming Rachel down or attacking James ourselves through a backtalk, which is probably the option that makes the most narrative sense, as Chloe's never been the one to back down from a confrontation. But no matter what you choose, Rachel ends up calling James out and asking for the truth, truth, which is where we get the big reveal, the big cliffhanger for the episode, in that the woman that James kissed is not his mistress, but in fact Rachel's real mother, which is pretty much the most melodramatic plot twist that they could have added here, for the person that Rachel assumes her father is cheating on her mom with to turn out to actually be her mom. But also, it just feels really forced for Rachel and Chloe to have just so happened to see this moment of them kissing, which the fact of why are they even kissing? It feels extremely contrived that for some reason they just randomly kiss, which that kiss is what really sparks the entire narrative here. Again, it is ridiculous to me, despite it on paper being this really mind-blowing twist. But now let's jump into the final formal episode in episode 3, Hell is Empty, which to me is a disaster of an episode, with me hating almost every aspect of this episode, but let's run through it anyway. The episode starts with James revealing the backstory with him and Sarah, Rachel's mom, which ends up being a mostly generic story of them being high school sweethearts and having Rachel really young, though Sarah becomes a drug addict, causing James to leave her and taking Rachel with him. But the most interesting aspect of this is James actually pays her to stay away from them, which he has now done for 15 years, but Sarah has now reappeared wanting to start a relationship with her daughter, which does lead to more melodrama moving forward. Now, after Rachel runs to her room, we end up following her and dumbly have to use a flashlight and a star globe to create this starry night effect in her room that awakens Rachel for some reason. But it does lead to them foregoing their plans to run away immediately, but instead now have the goal of finding Sarah. But this is followed by another dream sequence that has William explaining to Chloe why people keep secrets, which is just really weird, as it kind of implies that William did this to Chloe, but it doesn't actually lead to anything. And also seems to justify James's actions, despite later on in the episode we find out that it becomes a lot more sinister than what it seems to be at this point. Now afterwards, Chloe finally ends up returning home, which really ends up being a pointless scene for the main narrative, though does provide a final check-in with Joyce and David, with another confrontation with David, where David ends up revealing that his friend had died during his final mission in the army and states that he doesn't want Chloe to suffer the same pain, and hands her a photo of him and his friend, which is a really awkward scene, so Chloe can once again either take it or reject it, with her rejecting it, again making her look like a dick here, though it does align with the hostile relationship that we see from her and David in the first game, while the other option, again, has the two kind of bonding in this scene, that while it doesn't lead to anything in this game, again implies a better relationship for them moving forward, which again doesn't happen. So again, I really just found a lot of this scene very unnecessary. But then we leave for the junkyard with William's toolbox in hand, finally repairing the truck, and we get another tedious section of having to follow the instructions in the manual to finish the repairs. And this is while Chloe's also waiting for Frank to arrive, who we call up to meet with to learn more about Sarah, with Rachel joining us later. And Frank eventually ends up arriving, having brought Damon Merrick alongside him, with Damon clearly having some connection to Sarah, leading to a confrontation with Damon, whether or not you give him Drew's money here. But he eventually ends up figuring out that Rachel is James's daughter, James being the district attorney, which he finds out just from Chloe saying her first name, which I found to be a really dumb scene. But it leads to Damon now threatening Rachel with a knife as he wants to extort her for information on her father, which also doesn't make full sense considering what we learn later, but it leads to Rachel attacking him, to which he responds by stabbing her in the arm, which I know you're supposed to care about Rachel being stabbed here, but for me, there was really no stakes here, as we know that she's going to survive this due to Life is Strange 1, but also, I just laughed during this scene, as again, it just adds to the melodramatic nature of this game. But here we do have Frank holding Damon back as Chloe rushes Rachel to the hospital, being a small glimmer of what we would later see that makes the Frank and Chloe relationship really ridiculous, where they still have a hostile relationship in the first game despite going through such a traumatic experience here. But again, the arrival at the hospital ends up being this really over-the-top scene with this really emotional music playing as Chloe paces around the waiting room, but eventually we have this conversation with James where we tell him the situation. This ends up being our last true conversation with him. We can also spend some time saying our goodbyes to other characters that we don't get to interact with moving forward, like Rose, Rachel's not real mom, and also the Steph, Drew, Mikey trio, who are conveniently in the hospital room next to Rachel's, where we can play another tabletop game with them. We can also meet Anthony, Drew, and Mikey's father for some reason. Also, you can overhear talk about Samantha having been injured by Nathan, which obviously foreshadows his dark nature in the main game. But again, still feels like a strange contrast if you were to respond to him positively in the last couple episodes, which does make the conclusion to his storyline here very underwhelming. But obviously the plot ends up continuing by entering Rachel's room, where she still wants you to find her mother and tasks with Chloe with breaking into her dad's office to find information on her. But on our way out, we get this really strange interaction with Elliot, who, while he was concerned about Chloe in the previous episodes, here he really comes off as a lunatic. To where it does seem like a drastic change in his character, which has always been kind of funny to me, where he initially is this unassuming guy that clearly has a crush on Chloe and kind of coming off as a character similar to Warren, Life of Strange 1, but they really take that character and shift him into this weird stalker who's jealous of Chloe's relationship with Rachel, which I have always found ridiculous. And this leads to James's office, where we do get another slightly annoying gameplay section of trying to find the keys to his drawer, where through opening it, we do learn about the shady dealings that James is a part of, being cahoots with Damon, with him using Damon to threaten Sarah, and we find out that Damon has actually kidnapped her under the command of James in order to keep her away from Rachel. And this is a really dark turn for the story here, one that again comes off as really maniacal, where again James is so resolute in keeping Sarah out of Rachel's life, where first he was willing to pay her off, but then when she wasn't willing to take that, he now has resorted to kidnapping her and planning on killing her, which seems ridiculous. And the narrative really never truly explains James' point of view here, outside of him wanting to protect Rachel, which is how is this protecting Rachel, especially at the point where she already knows about Sarah anyway. So again, it really just makes him come off as maniacally evil here. Now we do end up finding James's phone and have to text Damon with it, leading to some more annoying gameplay sections of doing some favors for him, like destroying some evidence and calling out a snitch within his gang and showing him the money that was promised to him. But through this, you obviously learn about how deep James is in with Damon here. But through this, we do learn that Sarah is being conveniently held at the old mill, the location that the game started in. But before we can leave, we get the culmination to the Elliot storyline, where he just randomly shows up here in the Amber House, having followed us from the hospital, and blocks us from leaving and reactivates the alarm, which again, what a ridiculous turn for his character here, where he comes off as obsessive over Chloe and wants her all to himself, coming off deranged here. But this leads to a backtalk section where Chloe calls the police while pretending to agree with him. Now, if you succeed, obviously the police arrive and assumingly proceed to arrest him, while if you lose, Chloe still escapes, but instead does it by just setting off the alarm, causing Elliot to run away as well, with that ending up kind of underwhelming, considering he doesn't really feel like Elliot faces any ramifications for this. But after leaving, Chloe now heads for the old mill, where she almost gets into a car crash, and we get her final conversation with the illusion of William, which is a weird scene where we stand in front of the burned down forest and seemingly blame James for all of Rachel's actions, including her causing the forest fire, which I get the symbolism of this all being James's doing and being the ramifications of his actions, but again, it still comes off as ridiculous to me. But also, I just find this conversation also weird, where again, it shows it as if Chloe is growing as a character through this conversation, growing in a way that simply isn't there at the time of Life is Strange 1, as here she seems to grow appreciation for what a parent would do to save their child, which again is a lesson that's completely forgoed throughout the entirety of the main game. But then we get to the scene that stands out to me as the dumbest scene in the entire game, where we arrive at the old mill for the final confrontation with Damon, seeing Frank's RV right outside, where a fight had clearly occurred. And again, we can explore the old mill, now burnt down from the forest fire, giving us a vastly different experience from what we had the first time around. They're also showing the destruction that this situation caused, which again, for some reason, Rachel gets them to blame for in the narrative. But when walking into the main room, we find Damon having Sarah tied to a chair, where he reveals that James has paid him to kill Sarah here, and ends up doing the typical trope of trying to make it look like an overdose, and Chloe, being as useful as she is, gets knocked out almost instantly, while an injured Frank shows up and fights Damon, presumably killing him, which is a moment that is somehow never mentioned in the original game, which is the dumbest thing in this entire game to me. I mean, the fact that Chloe and Frank have such a strained relationship in Life is Strange 1, despite the fact that they are sharing the secret of Frank having killed a drug lord, which in turn does save Chloe's life. And this is somehow never referred to throughout the entire events of Life is Strange 1, which obviously the explanation to that is because these events weren't concepted until after Life is Strange 1, but further shows you how bad of a prequel this is because they have no regard for how this blends into Life is Strange 1, where that is the entire point of a prequel. And this is obviously one of the most egregious examples of this, though we do have one more later on. But then Chloe awakens, where we end up having a conversation with Sarah, which on paper seems like a great way to conclude this game, to have this conversation with this mysterious figure, where through this, having almost been murdered for wanting to meet her daughter, Sarah now decides that she doesn't want to meet her anymore. And this essentially sets up the future choice where Sarah wants us to not say anything about what happened at the mill or tell Rachel about James's corruptive actions, saying that she will never be a good enough mother and that she wants her to be with a father who loves her, which makes no sense. As one, I don't get how keeping Sarah away from Rachel is protecting her, especially at the point where she has been sober for a year and James knows that. But also, why are we considering keeping Rachel in the care of this manipulative figure a better option? I mean, I guess he has money and that's good, but he's also shown to be such a terrible human being here that I do find this rapid change in Sarah's mindset to be kind of ridiculous. But afterwards, we do return to Rachel's room at the hospital for the final choice in the game, where you can decide to lie to Rachel or tell her the truth, which none of this really matters, as no matter what, outside of this scene and the immediate scenes following it, of either seeing the Amber family get back together or in disarray, this is really a situation that we don't see any ramifications from this decision, which is what makes this entire situation even more dumb in connection to Life is Strange 1. And again, how is this never mentioned throughout all the times of Max and Chloe talking about Rachel? Like, you would think this is a pretty pivotal moment in Chloe's life, in her either holding this massive secret about James, Rachel's father, which in itself feels very un-Chloe-like, but also in the situation where she does tell Rachel, Rachel ends up disowning her father, which should have been a major event in Rachel's life. The life of Chloe's best friend moving forward for years, to the point where she dedicates her life to finding out where she's gone after her disappearance. So the fact that this major life event for Chloe never gets mentioned, neither by Chloe or by Joyce, who you would assume would have some inkling about this situation, it really is all just so ridiculous to me, and another really jarring moment for a narrative here. Now the final few scenes do show Rachel and Chloe hanging out with this super happy music, making it seem like this is their happily ever after. We potentially see Sarah and Rachel end up meeting, depending on your choices, though really, again, who cares? And again, the glorification of the Chloe-Rachel relationship to me is so weird in this game, especially if we have them start a romantic relationship, as we know from the events of the main game that she would later cheat on her with both Frank and Mr. Jefferson, which makes this really strange in context. Though I will say that I did like how the game leaves you off in having the final cutscene alluding to the fate of Rachel Amber by showing Chloe trying to call her while the phone sits on a table in the dark room with clicks of the camera going off in the background, alluding to her dark fate. Though I will say that I remember being underwhelmed that this wasn't alluded to more in the main story. Though technically it does align with canon, as Jefferson wasn't a teacher at Blackwell yet. Which does bring me to a final observation about the main story here, something that I actually never even noticed until my last playthrough, and that is something that the first game had also done, but it's something that future Life is Strange games don't follow anymore, and that is the concept of having each episode take place over the course of a singular day. Making the main story here take place over the course of only 3 days, which at first, again, is a pro. I like this small little reference to Life is Strange 1, but then you realize the ridiculousness of that, where you realize that Chloe and Rachel have literally only truly known each other for 3 days at the time of episode 3. And for all of these ridiculous events to be happening in their relationship, again, all within the first 3 days of them being friends, is also a really dumb aspect of this game that I never really fully picked up on until my replay, which makes all the events of this game even funnier to me. But that ends up being the entire main story of Before the Storm, but we still have one more episode to talk about, and that is the bonus episode, Farewell. This episode that has you back in control of Max, taking place with her as a kid as she hangs out with Chloe, also bringing back the original voice actors here to play the kid version of these characters. And this is a pretty small-scaled episode that takes place entirely in the Price house, and as the title implies, it was meant to be a farewell to the characters of Max and Chloe, and at first, I really loved this episode when I first played it. But as time has gone on, and the more and more you think about this episode, the more you realize how dumb the premise of this episode is, which we will obviously talk about. Now, there isn't that much plot to this episode, but it does start with Max and Chloe hanging out in Chloe's bedroom, blowing up some dolls with explosives for some reason. But afterwards, we do hear Chloe talk about how Joyce had told her to clean her room, leading to us having to help her in doing so, and along the way you get to interact with objects around the room, many of which have an extended history, with this duo being representations of their years of friendship, many of which Chloe refuses to throw away. But here we do learn that the main premise of this episode is that this is 3 days before Max is moving to Seattle, and for some reason she has still not told Chloe about this. And here we are given the choice of telling her or not, but either way Max is conveniently interrupted by Chloe to where she would have to tell her later anyway. But Chloe ends up finding an old cassette that has a message from them when they were younger, with them pretending to be pirates, something that, again, nice little callback to the original game, but this leads to most of the rest of the episode comprising of Max and Chloe searching for a treasure they buried as kids, leading to Max taking a trip to Chloe's attic, which leads to a weird Rush Hour-esque puzzle to get your way through to find an amulet that they left there years ago and is for some reason still there. But then we join Chloe in the backyard and have a tedious task, locate the final location of the treasure. But once we do, we find out that the treasure is a time capsule of their childhood memories. Again, a nice payoff to their relationship, with us getting to hear more about their background. But here we finally get the choice of whether or not to tell Chloe about Max moving, only for you to find out that if you tell her, that Chloe had already known all along. And to be fair, there had been foreshadowing to this throughout the episode, though it obviously kind of ruins the point of even having a choice there. But then we get to the end of the episode, which is just straight up ridiculous. And again, just simply does not make sense in continuity, which ends up being my biggest issue with this episode as a whole, in that at this moment, we see Joyce walking into the house, being accompanied by the police, with this clearly being immediately after William's car accident. And we see Chloe being told the news, and everyone goes into tears. On paper, a cool moment to show us this very integral moment in Max and Chloe's relationship. The problem is, we have already saw the moment that William leaves for the final time to pick up Joyce before his death in the original game, and through that comes a lot of inconsistencies. First, the beginning of the episode implies that Joyce is already home, when she clearly isn't at this point, and really all the events of the episode happening in the time after the events of the first game scene does also seem very convenient. Also, the clothes that Max and Chloe are wearing are different to that of the original, though that does have an explanation of them having just played dress up, which again also implies more time has passed here. Also, there's some wonkiness with a clock being shown in the original game that makes the timeline even more messed up, and I know one of the writers has come out to answer all of the people's complaints about the timeline here, where they do have explanations for all of the inconsistencies here, but the fact that they have to go out of their way to explain all of these inconsistencies really just shows you how little care they had for the actual consistency of the main story, making it feel like they wanted to make their own story, and then later coming up with excuses to rationalize the story that they wanted to tell. But even then, to me, that isn't even the worst part of the ending. The worst thing here, especially from a pure writing perspective, is the added context of this also being in conjunction with Max moving, which adds an extra level of melodrama to this sequence, where we get the following scene where it's the most ridiculous scene I've probably ever seen in any narrative-based game I've ever played, where we cut to William's funeral, where Max is being driven away by her parents as they head off to Seattle, as she watches a grieving Chloe and Joyce through her back window, and Chloe goes home to find a message of Max apologizing to her and saying that we'll always be Max and Chloe. And all this felt so ridiculous to the umpteenth degree that Max ends up leaving Chloe immediately after her father's death and proceeds to stop talking to her until the point that she ends up returning for the main game. This is insane and really makes Max come off as psychotic here in the way that she abandons Chloe, but again, in a way that feels very forced. But even beyond that, like how does this not have any effect on the main game? How is this never mentioned? This is a massive dick move from Max here. Something that clearly would have been brought up along the way had this been intended within the course of the original game, but is obviously a very clearly retcon plot point added to make this as melodramatic as possible, and really for me ends up being the dumbest scene in all of Before a Storm. Again, I've been complaining about Before a Storm since the beginning of the video. Again, pointing out the dumb things here and there. All the stuff revolving around Damon or James Amber, all that stuff's dumb. This takes the cake, though. This is the dumbest thing I have ever seen in any game, and it will stand out to me probably for all of time as the most botched scene in any prequel I've ever seen. But there we go. I mean, those are my thoughts on Life is Strange Before the Storm. Again, finally getting around to running through the game and talking about why I think this is one of the worst narrative-based games I've ever played. Now, I know I've said the terms ridiculous and melodramatic a billion times over the course of this video, but those are really the words that truly sum up my thoughts on this game. And because of that, I can't look at this game as anything other than a joke. A terrible prequel to the original game, while also providing a sloppy narrative in its own right. So again, I still came out of my replay hating this game, and at this point, I think that's something that will never change. But through that is crossing another Life is Strange retrospective off the board. The only game I haven't done a singular video about at this point is Life is Strange 2, plus Captain Spirit if you want to include that as a game, which I do intend on making a video on that at some point down the road to wrap the series up, though, again, exactly when, not entirely sure, but stay tuned for that. Obviously, more similar videos as well down the road, but for now, that's the video. Thank you for watching.